Close your eyes and imagine. What if the things in life that cause us the greatest pain, the things that bring us grief, are challenges? Challenges designed to help us grow, to ultimately become what we were always meant to be. We feel like we've been buried, but what if, like a seed, we've been planted? And having been planted, we grow to become a mighty tree. Now, open your eyes. Open your eyes to this way of viewing life. Come with me as we explore your true, infinite, eternal nature. This is Grief to Growth, and I am your host, Brian Smith. Computer. Hey everybody, this is Brian back with another episode of Grief to Growth, and I've got with me today a very special young man. His name is Jacob Cooper. Jacob Cooper is a clinical social worker. He's a certified Reiki Master and a certified hypnotherapist who specializes in past life regression therapy. He works privately with clients through online services. Inspired by his near-death experience and the transformative encounters, he facilitates spiritual awareness and empowerment through life-changing seminars. Currently, Jacob resides and practices in Long Island, New York. He's the author of Life After Breath, which is published by Waterside Productions. And just to let you know up front, if you do want to reach Jacob, his website is jacoblcooper.com. It's Jacob, Jacob, L as in Lee, Cooper.com. And with that, I want to welcome Jay Cooper to Grief to Growth.
Thank you so much for having me on as an honored guest, Brian. I'm a big fan of your work. Thank you.
No, thanks. I appreciate that. Jake, I've read several indie stories. I've had several people on the podcast who have had near-death experiences. One of the ways that you're unique, I usually ask people when you tell your story, start, wherever you like, whether you want to start with the experience or before the experience. But in your case, you were 3 years old when you had this experience. So probably not a whole lot of life experience before that. But tell our listeners about this experience you had when you were 3 years old, or wherever you'd like to start.
Absolutely. So I was 3 years old. At the time, I didn't know it, but I had an highly contagious upper respiratory virus called pertussis, otherwise known as whooping cough, which left untreated for infants, children, or even adults, in rare cases for the adults, but mostly infancy and children, could be fatal if left untreated due to suffocation. And so I went to a park that September morning with family friends of mine, and at the time it was my babysitter and my sibling, and I was just going there to the park like any other day and just having a good time there. As I was in the car, I began kind of noticing a bit of just kind of dizziness, or noticing kind of like a different energy around me, which I describe in the book as a vortex of energy around myself that just felt almost kind of like a vacuum for my inner being that I just pushed aside and ignored because, my mind was telling me one thing, but, a part of me just wanted to go out there and have a good time. So I buried conventional wisdom that something profound that I couldn't quite touch was on the horizon. And I just wanted to play in the playground. And so I got out of the car, despite the nausea and, some just dizziness that I was having. And I just ran as fast as I could up to the ladder onto a slide. And as I was climbing up each rung of the ladder of the slide, my breathing became more belabored and more debilitated through every step that I was climbing. The nausea continued to grow. Then I got to the top of the slide. All of a sudden, I was really starting to slowly suffocate, and I was getting very little air, at the top of the ladder. And then slowly that continual feeling of that vortex that I was seeing in the car and that familiarity with it began to race to my inner being at some insane speed. And I followed it, and then slowly I began noticing that my body was no longer working due to the deprivation of oxygen, and every part of my body just began shutting down, like you take a power breaker in a home and just shut down each switch, and that was happening to my body, one switch at a time, due to the deprivation of oxygen. The last part that I recalled being aware of was being kind of outside my body and looking in at my brain and being able to notice different components of my brain and different functionings. And it's as if the statement is true that we use a very small percentage of our brain in our lifetimes. And certainly it's very hard to understand the brain with the brain, never mind being 3 years old. Adults fully educated and stuff like that still are still finding new findings within the brain,
Hmm.
no matter what program of neuroscience or neurosurgery you are in. Uh, but I noticed that due to deprivation of oxygen, I felt a large cracking noise within my brain as if you take a plug out of a wall and just yank it out. And so I was unplugged from my body and my brain, and I just
Hmm.
heard this large snap. And then after that, that vortex just began just to quickly suck my body, and not my body, but my inner being, down this insane tunnel. And I was going at an infinite rate, an infinite speed, going upwards and upwards and upwards. And there was no limitation with how high and how far I was soaring.
Hmm.
And slowly I just entered this. The best way I could describe it, as cliche as it sounds, was this mystical light, this quite familiar light, and I entered this place. And as I was entering this, I began to notice the right side of, the part of my brain that I was looking at from a third person out of body experience. And I began noticing this incredible mystical palace that I just almost had to shield myself away from, because this palace's light was just so bright, and I
Hmm.
could hear vibrations, sounds, choirs by it, and angelic beings within it. And the most way I could describe it was just just an intimate connection, with the all that ever is and ever was. It was, to me, just a connection with the creator in a sense. And people have different experiences with the creator. I think it's all limiting, but I think, when I was crossing over, it was just a very intimate connection to a high octave of the creator,
Hmm.
presented to me in a way that I could comprehend and understand. And so, as I was connecting to this, there was an adjustment phase where it was just too profound and too powerful to look at, where I just almost had to shield myself from this familiarity. And
Hmm.
then slowly, I began to notice awareness of not necessarily Jesus Christ, the man depicted, in pictures or in the Bible that people practice, or the worldview of Christ, but more of the interconnectivity to the consciousness of Jesus, or consciousness of Christ. And in a way, that's very diametrically different than, what other people say, because it's an interconnectivity. And hopefully we'll get into more QA on that,
Oh
the
yeah.
differentiating components. But, when connecting to this, I was, feeling as scared as I possibly could, um, in just terms of leaving my body behind, my life behind. And I just connected to this eternal wave of love, protection, guidance, support that was so beyond anything that I experienced, which isn't a knock to my culture or family. It's just this high octave of unconditional love, mysticism, and high understanding
Hmm.
of the other side, and this high awareness. And after connecting to that, I began to notice my two spiritual guides who were with me on the slide, on the top of the slide. And literally, I felt a male and female guide. At the time, I clearly knew who they were, what their names were, and I felt quite ashamed and embarrassed that I forgot their identity. It's just,
Hmm.
it's as if you just forgot to tie your shoes, or you forgot your first name. It's just so close to your heart that I just forgot that they were with me this entire time. I was just I had a blind spot on, during those 3 years. And when I
Hmm.
looked at them, they were the most magnificent beings. It wasn't, like clairaudient or this was as if, I mean, you're a beautiful man, but looking at you right here today, it's just right in front of me. But they were right to the side of me, and I was able to
Hmm.
see them
Hmm.
through my peripherals. And then slowly they began to push my body through their own force down the slide. And my body was, irresponsive when my guides pushed me. And then
Hmm.
slowly I began to notice all the people that I went to the park with that day, calling my name, and I was just very irresponsive to them. And I was able to be aware of my, what I could like to call my spiritual body or my soul body. And I was able to feel a form on the side of my body. And I was able
Hmm.
to see all the people who were calling my name, but I felt almost kind of like a caged animal. Like I was trying to communicate to them, and they could see me, but they weren't seeing the true me. I could
Hmm.
hear them, but they couldn't hear me. And it was quite torturous at the time. I wanted to grab them and saying, "I'm okay. Are you? Because I'm, on the other side. And this is terrific." And I never felt more connected in this lifetime to my true essence than this moment. And
Mm-hmm.
but they were calling my name, and they weren't responsive. And then in that moment, I was able to look at through my soul's eyes or mind's eyes on their energetic bodies, or what we would call electromagnetic auric fields. And I was able to see a lot of components about the people that I went to the park that day that maybe I wasn't privy to or aware of at the moment, such as, some of their purposes and, even past lives. And, I was able to see them not just from a face value human component, but from a spiritual component. And I get a little bit more into that in Life After Breath with some of the specificities of it. And then instantaneously, upon looking at them, I was able to be privy to just hundreds and thousands of angels that were hovering around my body and around the park. And these were not these big archangels necessarily. These were more of the cherubim type of angels. Within the background, I was aware of those larger angels, but in front of me, floating, were these childlike angels, and they were kind of like brown and gold. And they were a lot less human in their characteristic and their affect than my spiritual guides. They were just, just looking in the direction. And it's almost like I could see them, but they weren't so connected to me personally. They were more connected to the macro kind of energy, not so much focused on the micro,
Mm-hmm.
me. And
Mm-hmm.
so I was able to see them, and I was just so blown away. And, even my human part, I was still carrying over. I was just like, geez, am I, making this up? Is this real? And it was literally a filter of an endless sea of angels that was right in front of me, and then distance, I had awareness of the best term I could describe it for listeners. And at the time I didn't have these terms, this is kind of the terms that people you know, have to them. But to me, terms are our ultimate superpower, and just in terms of understanding, but they don't do justice or justification in its full description. But I would say soul family members came to me in the distance, and they slowly started coming to me. And instantaneously, I knew who they were, what they were about. And it's just almost as if you feel an enmeshment of your close core of people that know you transparently, inside, outside, front ways and back ways, and vice versa. And, when they saw me and interacted with me, I felt quite embarrassed. And why I use the word embarrassed is, it's almost as if you have a party, you're going to the military, and you have this big bash for like a week or two, and you make all these promises, and everyone's giving you all these well wishes. And then within a week or two, you just come back and say, no, not for me, or something like that. So, that wasn't their judgment of me. That was my own judgment. They
Mm-hmm.
loved me for not what I did, but who I was. And that's so much more diametrically different than this life as we know it for the most of us, ain't it?
Yeah.
After seeing them and my spiritual guides, and connecting with higher divine energy, I was posed a question which is what I was going to do within this particular path. Was I going to stay, cross over on the other side, or was I continue to live, this lifetime, as 3-year-old Jake, obviously, different from this experience. And
Mm-hmm.
then I got kind of my lawyer business hat on, and I said, well, if I do that, let's make a deal. What is this lifetime going to be? What am I going to experience? Why am I here? What's the point of it? For me to turn you guys down, I better have a better counter that will outweigh it and have more capital than heaven, if that's possible.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was being shown a life review, as I would best describe it, not only of this lifetime, but what stuck to me was mostly, other past lifetimes. And it was as if I was going on an overlay of the planet, and I was able to just go from culture to culture, country to country, and have different, glimpses and different filters of other lifetimes. And I was just spanning the globe, just traveling all different eras and time frames on an overlay of the earth. And the most recent lifetime that I had was when I had all these students that came to me, and all these children that I just knew instantaneously, and they were given to me in flashing imagery. And I became quite emotional just in terms of the memories that I had, and just the relationship and the recollection of that last lifetime in which I committed suicide after feeling like my back was against the wall and there was no hope. And I was some type of teacher for children. A lot of kids kind of depended on me,
Mm-hmm.
and I took my own life in that last carnation, from my back against the wall. I just felt very hopeless, very trapped, and there was no forward, there was no path. It was nothing to get past the pylons. I was just very kind of trapped. Um, and then slowly I was able to see flashing imagery of this lifetime that I would live. And then I was able to see a crowd of people that I was speaking to. And when I saw that lifetime, it wasn't as if I was some guru or some superior to the people or some teacher that was better than the people, but rather I was just a part of the symphony of the message. I was just a part of everyone. It was just an interconnectedness of uplifting, of energy, of truth that was from that particular imagery. And I said at that time, as beautiful as heaven is, you know, bringing it into this lifetime and living this path is bringing the hereafter into the here now. And um, I just turned it down. And then, slowly I recognized, future glimpses of the earth, and just in terms of a lot of the chaos and darkness and divisiveness. But through that darkness, through the deprivation of it, I saw people coming into new form and changing, which hopefully we'll get into, because there's a lot of universality behind that, from an individual to collective. It's all interconnected. And then slowly that's when everything powered down. Once I made that decision to stay, then I got a degree of, cold feet or doubt, as if like, what the heck did I just do? Like, I just turned down that to come back to, this earth. And I'm just like, Jesus, I was just like kicking myself. I just, again, asked the question. I'm always a question kind of guy. And I guess that kind of put me into the job as a therapist and stuff like that. I love figuring out why the things are the way that they are and figuring out solutions to problems. And I just said, how do I know that this is going to happen? And they gave me one of the biggest superpowers, which is the power of thought, the power of perception, and the power of path, in the sense that the higher the vibratory your thoughts are, the more in symmetry they are within flow, within the path. And the more that your thoughts kind of are in parallels with fear, kind of lower energy, the more, in a sense, that will kind of take you off that path and put you on a lower vibratory path and a more difficult path, not necessarily relating to the series of events, but more in terms of your ability to be able to manage life circumstances. And then that's when everything shut down, and I was left on a hospital bed, with my mother, who was quite distraught. And at the time, my mother told me that I was so angry that I kicked the doctor and ran around the room, that I was absolutely furious, in a sense that here I was turning down heaven, and I was put in such a different vantage point from the other side, in the light of it, on a cold hospital bed, being operated on, just dependent on, like a medical personnel. And, we'll get into that a little bit more, because I think my book really talks about the psychosociological developmental angle from this profound experience at the age of 3 years old.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. There's so much I want to go into with that. First of all, I want to remind the listeners, the viewers, because it's going on YouTube and my podcast. You were 3 years old when you had this experience, which is very unusual. It's interesting when you talk about the experience itself and even the time before. Your memories of it are so detailed, and most of us don't remember anything before the age of like 5. So one of the questions I know people that have these experiences early in life is, how could you possibly remember what happened?
Mm-hmm. What I would say is, certainly as a psychotherapist, I definitely have professional capital and legs to stand on when it comes to understanding of trauma and how that works. At least from my experience, I can't think of anything more traumatic than suffocating, and dying, right? And so, that's an experience, no matter how old or how young, has a capacity to stick with you. And when it comes to trauma, not only do you remember the actual event, but you have memories of the surrounding event, the events that kind of came a little bit after and a little bit before, and that has to deal with trauma. And also there's the euphoric element of this experience, where this defies all conventional wisdom. You're right. In a sense, how do I remember things at such a young age? And I'm no different than anyone else. I remember very little other than these incredible transformative experiences.
Mhm.
When you're connecting to the other side, that goes against all logic within, because it's not produced from this body.
Right.
It's filtered through the body, and you're connected to a much higher realm that's eternal. It's not from the finite mind that's limited in its, recollection. It's not the conscious mind. You're connected to the subconscious eternal mind. And so that's in many ways how it stuck with me. And
Mhm.
so if you watch the Netflix documentary, Surviving Death, you'll see, I think at the last episode, they have an episode of like a child who remembers his past lifetime as a pilot and,
Mhm.
all the details and stuff like that. And so I know the University of Virginia has a whole case study of children's past lives. And I know that's one of the prerequisites to become, I guess like a Buddhist monk or stuff like that. You have to remember your last life. And so, infants have a very high capacity to remember their previous lifetimes that are
Yeah.
not produced by this body. And
Right.
so if that's possible, then certainly it would lay itself into possibility of remembering, parts from infancy and even, natal kind of periods and stuff
Yeah.
like that. So
That. Yeah.
I hope that makes sense.
Absolutely. That's an excellent answer, and maybe the best I've heard was from to describe this. I also want to say that it's not unusual for children as young as 2 or 3 or even younger who have had these experiences, even infants, even children before they even have language can remember them. Ingrid Hankala, who I've had on my show, and Ingrid had an experience when she was like 2 years old, and she remembers it in great detail. And I love what you said though, but the thing is that trauma can bring back memories, and some people do have memories of not even near death experiences, but just something traumatic that happened when they were at that age. So
The
it,
transformation. Yeah.
yeah, it makes sense. And I'm glad that you gave that answer. And for anybody that's doubting that, I wanted to put that out there. The other thing I noticed though, that like, even when you went to the other side, the way you describe it, you seem to have a different level of consciousness than a 3-year-old would have. Like the negotiations you made about coming back. And do you feel like your consciousness shifted when you crossed back over? Did you become like your higher self, for lack of a better word?
I would say that no infant or no child is how we perceive them, most of us, in a sense that we're not our bodies, we're not our ages, we're not numbers, we're not even our names. And so, to how people saw me or how probably the external portrayal of myself, that probably wasn't in parallel. But when we look at an infant, we look at a child, there's the external portrayal, and then there's the internal processing that happens that, isn't communicated or isn't expressed. And so that was connected to not my necessarily 2 or 3-year-old self, as
Mhm.
normally I don't think any of us are at our core that. It was to the deeper waters of my soul that I was connected to, which was not bound by time, place, culture, anything like that. And so it was a lot more of an expanded awareness and connectivity to that. But I think, in a way, um, the way that I could describe the soul is not the mind, not our worries, not our limitations, but rather the deep sacred observer beyond the surface. And
Mhm.
that's always kind of there underneath the surface. That can never leave us. And, that's the part that I got and connected to. And that was always with me within this lifetime. The soul doesn't just all automatically change when we become 21, 22. In fact, a lot of people become a lot more soulless than soulful at that age. And so
Mhm.
infants, children, probably have a lot more connectivity to that deeper part of them and are in a way almost kind of like Benjamin Buttons. There's an age reversal that happens where we physically grow up, integrate into this world, look more mature and could play the game better, but our true essence at times fades away. And so I look at children and infants as some of the higher souls and more aware souls, or older than some 90 or 100 years olds,
Yeah.
in a way,
That's
if we look at
beautifully
it like
said.
that.
Yeah, that was beautifully said, and I completely agree. It reminds me. There's a song I love that talks about how we come into this world innocent and pure, and then it's called "The Way of the World" by Earth, Wind, and Fire. And
It's a
I
great
know
song. Yeah,
I love
I
that
love
song
that.
because I think it's just so true. We come in and we're pure and we're innocent, and then we learn to play the game the way you said it, and we forget who we were. It's interesting you got this reminder, this reset at the age of 3. I think that's another really thing that's unusual about your experience. But thank you for that answer. Another thing about your experience, a lot of times, again, people will say, well, when people have never experienced, no death experience, they're just seeing it's just wish fulfillment. They're seeing what they expect. It's what they're culturally expected to see. So when I read in your book, and I want to read a short passage from one of the chapters, you said that you perceived Jesus. You said you didn't see Jesus, but you perceived Jesus, if I remember correctly.
It's more of like a hearing and inner knowing. And
Yeah.
it's funny because I grew up, in a religious, traditional community, went to Hebrew school, all that stuff, and
Mm-hmm.
followed all the rules, and, modern Orthodox, Jewish kid. Jesus was born a Jew and died a Jew. He's probably more Jewish than I myself am. He was in Israel, right, and stuff
Mm-hmm.
like that. So, in my lifetime, that wasn't something that I was exposed to,
Right.
and I certainly understand within Jewish tradition, there's a lot of pushback, not necessarily from Jesus himself, but what came after him through the Crusades and attacks on Jews. And so I could understand how a lot of people misinterpreted the message and used it as violence, and
Mm-hmm.
that couldn't be more diametrically opposite to the life that Jesus stood for.
Mm-hmm.
So I could understand that. So from seeing that, it was just a whirlwind of difference from the culture environment that I was exposed to at that young age.
Yeah.
um, and so it would make sense for me to see more so Moses in in a staff, or
Exactly.
um, Joseph, or someone else from Genesis,
Right.
or the Old
Right.
Testament.
As much cultural conditioning as you could have at the age of 3, you would expect that. And so I do want to read this passage because I think it's beautiful. You said, I understood that Jesus was the closest depiction of man and God, higher consciousness form than we can comprehend. In that moment, I was conscious of his desire to spread loving messages and not to focus on the ending of his life, but rather on his love of service, forgiving his neighbors and bringing heaven down to earth through his own sacrifice and trials and tribulations. I was aware that his life was in all of us and that we have the capacity to embody elements of him within each and every one of our journeys. For he is an undeniable part of ourselves, one that is always with us, even if we at times lose sight of it. I thought that was beautiful. And it's actually a project I've been thinking about doing where I wanted to ask people, what does Jesus mean to you? And if you don't mind, I would love to include that, when I do this project. I think that's a beautiful synopsis of Jesus, who the Christ is.
Please do. And I don't mean to have a monopolization of heaven or God.
Mm-hmm.
I was just some kid who had this experience at a young age, and I had a small taste of it. But I look at my everyday experience as a way to come closer to understanding. I think if truth becomes stagnant, it turns into a religion. But if truth becomes open-ended and exploratory, it's more goes the lines of spirituality. And that's more the beginner's mind, Buddhist kind of mentality, where the master's mind is the mind who knows, who's open, and not defined by what they know and experience. But certainly, a lot of people say, is Jesus God? Is God God? What's this? What's that? I say, we're all expressions of that, but different figures throughout history have a higher octave, a higher vibration of that we're not meant to put on a pedestal, but rather learning to integrate and to learn that that is possible within our lifetimes. And, to be reminded of the possibility to reach in deeper gears that are a lot more than how we perceive ourselves, but are more reflective of what's in ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing I want to touch on in terms of your experience, again, we talked before we got started, because the experience itself is fantastic. It's interesting. But what are the lessons? And one of the other lessons I saw, and you point this out when you talk about the experience, is that you said you felt a little bit embarrassed that you'd already forgotten your guides, but they were always with us. And so I think a lot of times, us as adults, we forget our guides are with us. So what would you say to people that say, I do I have guides?
Yeah. If anyone's interested too, I have monthly events on Facebook Live. And one of the topics that's going to be coming, it's the last Monday of each month, and it's open free to the community. And down the road, one of the specific topics on my professional page is spiritual guides. What I would say is a lot of people, if they don't get every single mark checked off, right, in terms of their guides, they listen to a lot of people talk, and they'll be able to talk about not only their guides, but their guides' past life, their guides' mothers, their their guides' spirituality, and then they'll feel like, oh, that's what these people are experiencing, and I'm just, having what I'm having, so it's disvalidated.
Mm-hmm.
What I would say is, each experience is unique, and each experience is a part of your own dosage of reawakening, because I think we're truly all awakened. It's just about the integration of that. And so ultimately, I don't connect to my guides daily. Sometimes I even question their names, which is why I don't put in the book.
Hmm.
But that doesn't mean that you can't connect to them in your own special way, that you can't have a dialogue. And I look at meditation as a great intimacy with your guides and the other side. You're able to get into the sacred silence and feel, those beings around you, and you're enhancing your energy, your vibration, so that their vibration could match yours. When you're feeling very stuck, closed head, closed heart, it's very hard for flow of energy to come into you. But I think certainly everyone has spiritual guides. We're born with them. They know us before this lifetime in the charting phase. And so they never leave us. We just at times leave them. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that we feel unworthy to have these beings who invest in us so much, who care about us so much. It's not
Hmm.
self-aggrandizing to think that.
Hmm.
But I think also the illusion that isolation that people have, where when we feel pain, we feel that we're just, pain could lead us on an illusionary path, that we're isolated and, we're in eternal suffering just alone. And one thing that I truly learned, and I talk a little bit more about this in my second book, which is more of direct implicative lessons of the here now, the hereafter, the here now, is just that illusionary sensation of being alone, and how
Mm-hmm.
we could have that state of mind, but the state of reality presents itself a little bit differently, that we're always surrounded and guided and protected. We just not always are aware of that.
We'll get back to grief to growth in just a few seconds. Did you know that Brian is an author and a life coach? If you're grieving or know someone who is grieving, his book, Grief to Growth, is a best selling, easy to read book that might help you or someone you know. People work with Brian as a life coach to break through barriers and live their best lives. You can find out more about Brian and what he offers at www.grieftogrowth.com, www.grief, the number 2, growth.com, or text growth, growth, to 31996. If you'd like to support this podcast, visit www.patreon.com/grieftogrowth, www.patreon.com/grief, the number 2, growth, to make a financial contribution. And now, back to Grief to Growth.
Yeah, it's interesting that you talked about that being alone. There's a young man, his name is Roland Etchenjang, and he wrote a book, Who and Why We Are. And one of the things he said in his book is like, one of the things we agree when we come into this life is we agree to this feeling of abandonment, which seems to be universal, that we all feel alone on some level at some point. So it's an interesting thing that you talked about. Even at 3 years old, you had already forgotten that you were never alone.
Even at then, so I could understand how adults forget.
Mm-hmm.
Even at 3 years old, starting to fall asleep at the wheel a little bit, right? And just having a little bit of amnesia of
Yeah.
that. And so, um, sure, I can understand how adults are doing that. But there's so much symmetry with what's happening on a macro and micro basis to my experience, in a
Mm-hmm.
sense that, from a young age, at 3 years old, I had an upper respiratory, highly contagious virus called pertussis, or whooping cough. And
Mm-hmm.
that caused me to suffocate. And
Mm-hmm.
hence the title, Life After Breath. I suffocated, and there was an eternal life past the limited breath within the body. There's eternal breath of the spirit. There's eternal life of the spirit that I was able to remember. And
Mm-hmm.
I think impermanence is blown into our face a lot more these days with the macro upper respiratory virus that's happening today. And a lot of people are feeling, just very uncertain about their lives. And a lot of people in many ways feel breathless, and they've got nothing to hold on to. They're grasping for straws in the outer world because it's that rug has been pulled. And so for people to not only just survive or thrive, people now need to find different gears that they may not have turned from, prior comfort. And so I think this time has posed people to kind of expedite some of their storehouses of inner truth in their own backyard to come out more, as the outer stimuli is more enhanced and, and thrown away a little bit more these days.
Yeah, absolutely. So, another thing I wanted to ask you, you had this experience at 3 years old, and a lot of times when people have near-death experiences, almost always it takes some integration to get to kind of readjust once they come back.
Mhm.
For adults, that can be 7 to 14 years. For children, it could be 20 to 30 years.
Yeah.
You're only 30 years old now. So how do you feel how did this experience impact your growing up, and how are you integrating it now?
You know, I view everything as a blessing, but looking back on it, it was certainly had a, just pure fact. It was a double-edged sword.
Hmm.
It was very allegorical of the near-death experience in the sense that in order to see the light, I had to see some of the dark and the suffocation to really remind myself of the light. It's hard to see the light at times without the dark. It's
Mm.
hard to remind ourselves of the infinite without its opposite of the finite. And I had the most direct connection with finite suffering and suffocation, the most connectivity with infinite through eternal breath, through understanding eternity. But I would say, matter of fact, I grew up in a home, four children. My parents were more so in the here now than the hereafter. They were hardworking people. My father was a psychotherapist, but out of all the four children, we all had the same food, the same environment, the same classes. You could ask anyone who knew the family. I was by far the most difficult child. I was a PIA, to them, from ever since that experience. And I think that has a lot of layers to it. I think
Hmm.
obviously the trauma that happened, as well as the inner rebel that was born in me, that in a sense that I wasn't programmed on this kind of mechanism, that kids were kind of put on, where we're just kind of taught that we're blank slates, and the parents had authoritative figure, were authoritative figures, and teachers were, and we just put, our lives in other people's hands. And I was very defiant and oppositional in a sense that it wasn't able to be expressed at the time, but a part of me could no longer be able to play the game as other people saw me. I saw myself as a lot older and a lot kind of wiser than
Yeah.
some of the mature adults who were just trying to reel me in. And so I was very defiant. And you combine that with the strict traditional, religion that had a monopolization of God that tried to program that into my head, that was very much God in man's image, a God of very much this world that was
Hmm.
kind of portrayed. It was very hard for me. And so I had years of therapy. I had a very difficult time from purely, physiological standpoints, suffocating, having my brain deprived of oxygen. My brain was much different, and I was a lot more comfortable in that realm than in this realm. But
Yeah.
ultimately, to survive at the time, I had to push away heaven. But later in life, to thrive, I had to learn how to integrate it. If
Wow.
that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was, again, beautifully stated, I think. It's interesting because we were talked about earlier about we come in and we have to learn to play the game. But when you get that reset that you got at like the age of 3, and I know Ingrid went through the same thing. Ingrid Hankel, I mentioned earlier, she would look at adults and it's like, I'm the same as you are. She was 2 years old, and they're like, she rejected her name. She said, that's not my name.
Right.
And people would look at her and it's like, yeah, what's going on with this little girl? So I love that you include that in your story in the book, that it's not all sunshine and roses. And sometimes people from the outside will look at a near death experience and say, oh, I wish I could have a near death experience because it's such a great thing, but it does come with a price.
Sure. I mean, I was in my book, I talk about this through many years, very struggled within school systems. I would fight it. And even if I tried, I couldn't really focus because my brain chemistry was changed from that.
Hmm.
And so I had a very hard time. And so, through therapy and through taking medication, all this kind of stuff, it helped me out. But it wasn't until I would say my early 20s when like you said, the 20 to 30 year period where I was able to kind of crack in and being able to understand it. On a deeper level, an internal perspective, I knew what was going on. but to be able to ground the hereafter into the here now,
Yeah.
that's something that takes a whole lifetime. But to crack the surface on that, I re-began that process probably in my early 20s when I had kind of like a holistic spiritual awakening that had many different kind of experiences. And I know in my book, part of that was an out-of-body experience and training in different kind of energy principles. And I think ultimately it was one of the gifts of suffering, with the life that I was living and just the uncertainty of where I was going. And so to remember where I wanted to go, I had to truly remember who I was. Because ultimately, if I didn't know who I was, I could be anybody. If I didn't know where I came from, I could be going anywhere. And so ultimately, it's the uncertainty that tried to get me to come to grips with more allies of certainty within that time frame.
I wanted to ask you about how you feel about like soul planning. You mentioned earlier when you had this experience when you were 3, you saw kind of like your soul group, I think you said, around you. And as I was reading your book, there were a couple people that came in your life or that were played key roles in your life, like your Aunt Seal. And I wonder how you feel about her. And then there was Armana, the woman that you'd seen. I don't remember what time frame it was where you saw Armana, the psychic. But as I was reading that, I'm sorry.
Around that time frame, we still keep in touch, her and I.
Yeah, and I'm like, so I think there are people in our lives, and I'm going to ask you this as an informative question. Do you feel like there are people in our lives that are just like they come along at the right moment and give us what we need?
Absolutely. I think Brian Weiss says that angels just aren't these beings on the other side. They come in human form too, and in animal form too, in disguise. And
Mm-hmm.
I think, Dr. Brian Weiss is very accurate in that. And I think part of the gain of living this lifetime is through these experiences with other people. Not only do they help us to see much more of how we think we are and who we truly are, but in a sense that they're almost, sometimes I think in a way, this lifetime is very much a school, not to be punished, stuff like that, but to have an opportunity. And I think in many ways that opportunity is to be there of service, to learn what it's like to be a guide here so that we could be a guide when we cross over a little bit easier from the time. So it's hard to run a marathon without running a couple of laps beforehand. I think this is practice to get to that point. So
yeah, so talk about like, for example, your Aunt Seal, her influence on your life, or how she influenced you.
yeah, she was actually it's funny. Her life had a lot of allegory to it. She was a singer, Feliz Navidad. Was it like Jose Feliciano, something like that?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
I think he had like vision impairments. My Aunt Seal was actually his teacher. And she taught those with visual impairments, in the Queen's school system. And that was allegorical for life that she lived. She was, we grew up in this Jewish tradition, but she was very much into Kabbalistic teachings and Jewish mysticisms and Sylvia Brown and all these other people. And so she believed in people to be able to see what they couldn't see, to trust in this kind of unseen world. And so she allowed those who were blind to be able to see other parts of them. And at her funeral, there was all these people who had vision impairments and were blind, and they were just hysterically crying. And I think, when a part of us isn't necessarily connected to as much, a lot more times people are more in tune to their emotional parts, and other parts of their sensitivities are a little bit stronger. So it's just so profound to see the impact that she had. But that's just the person that she was. And so she was very much a guide to not only myself, but to hundreds of students to be able, on a practical basis, to learn how to integrate into this world with not being able to see, but to trust in, these other components to ourselves. And to me, at least, she was very much a mentor, in terms of giving me all these reading assignments to kind of get me to be able to see when at times I might have suppressed vision, of these own realities, and just kind of bog that down, kind of like a beach ball in a pool, right? So she was a profound, and still is a profound guide and teacher.
Yeah, yeah, and like I said, I was impressed by her impact in life, and also Armana, the psyche that you saw, which I thought was also interesting because, as you said, being raised a traditional Orthodox Jew, we don't. I just had someone on the other day that she's Jewish, like we don't see psychics. So the fact that you would even
It's starting to change a little bit, especially as Science is catching up, and
Hmm.
I know wonderful organizations such as, let's just say, Forever Family Foundation is coming up, with all these, tested mediums and scientific tested mediums. So I think science and, the afterlife are really working more in harmony. But I think really truly with the amount of pain that people are going through, I think all religions are being a little bit more, in some degree, a little bit more flexible. Where if it's resourceful, if it's helpful, I think, in this time frame, then in a sense, kind of like removing some stuff that we've believed in the past, if it's resourceful. But there's a little bit more bend that I'm starting to notice within people who practice religion to kind of tap into a little bit more of the spirituality. And I know I say the hereafter exists not because of religion, but despite of it, right?
Yeah.
So, um, and spirituality exists because of, not despite of too. But Hermana was interesting because I went to her, and most people would say, okay, if you see a neon light sign on and you see this the storefront, don't go there. And that's
Exactly.
true. I think 85% of these people are just kind of storefronts and just kind of charlatans in
Hmm.
a way. But she was so much different. I've gotten readings from some of the best, and she was by far one of the very best, intuitives that I've ever had. And since she tapped into, she just saw through me everything that I had, including that past lifetime that I connected to.
Hmm.
That was like the first time that someone had that, because I had this recollection of my near-death experience, but I was haunted in my childhood of that suicide that I had and experienced. And she, without me getting public, this is before I started lecturing, which was in 2015, 2016. This must have been a couple of years before that she tapped into that. And it was just like, and so it's very validating,
Hmm.
from understanding the soul's purpose and to understanding that, wow, that other people are able to tap into this stuff. I'm not just alone in this kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, as you said, and I kind of smiled when you said it, we see these storefront psychics and we're like, they're all fake. And maybe most of them are, but there are definitely, real people out there as well. And when we come across them, they blow our minds, they completely change our worlds.
Yeah, and I think anyway, anyone could come out and saying that I'm a life coach, I'm a psychic. There's no kind of overlying governing a body to
Right.
determine that. I think now there's added a lot more credibility where we're having evidential mediums, evidential intuitives going through a ringer of, of tested. I know Gary Schwartz runs different programs.
Hmm.
Dr. Gary Schwartz runs different programs, and I know Harvard has different programs to kind of test, these evidential mediums and intuitives. I think that's very important because I'm sure you could agree to this. When we're most vulnerable, we have to be the most privy to with who we give our vulnerability to. We have to be careful with who we place our grief in the hands of. Many people could say, and we read New York Times stories of people getting kind of conned with all these kind of psychics when we're most vulnerable. We're looking for answers. We're thirsty for any given answers. And people will say, okay, you do this, I'll pay me $100,000. I'll clear your energy field and I'll light these candles and I'll bring forward your loved ones. And, so,
Hmm.
when we're desperate, never go to the grocery store when we're hungry, never go on a date when we're lonely. And certainly we never go to someone who's not credible when we're feeling, intensified grief,
Yeah.
from a
I
therapist or medium perspective. So,
yeah, great. That was again so well said because one of the criticisms, and I've worked with a lot of mediums and I've interviewed a lot of mediums and I know a lot of mediums, and most of them are great people. The ones I know, I've been very fortunate.
sure.
They're very spiritual people. They want to help people, but one of the criticisms is they're all spiritual vampires, and they just suck on your grief. And those people are certainly out there, but we do have to be discerning, as you were saying. We need to to get recommendations, validations as much as we can.
Sure.
I personally would never just go to someone that just out of the yellow pages.
Yeah.
That dates me, but
You have to trust your gut. Sure. And I know, like,
yeah.
let's say Bob Olson, who's got a book or two out there, but he's got a psychic directory that goes through his own testing too. And I know on my
Hmm.
website I have, and again, I'm not a paranormal researcher, but I have, a couple of evidential mediums and psychics, up there, for people as resources too, if people are interested, in getting readings that I refer. Let's say I'm working with a client as a therapist and they're just kind of hitting a wall with the grief. There's nothing that I could do or say to them, in a way that would expedite the amount of healing that someone with evidential information has in a way. And I think, it's important to see a therapist to work on, the ground up perspective, but at times getting that evidential understanding doesn't change the line of events, but it causes, grief to formulate its way onto belief, which is a great transition for people, to, start, in the way the healing, which has no true timetable in a way. It
Yeah.
comes in waves. So.
Yeah, what you said there also I think was really interesting about, like, seeing a therapist and seeing a medium, for example. There's a place for both, and they each serve different roles. Getting a great medium reading can be extremely healing, and that's one thing that people, because even as therapists, as grief counselors in the past, the model was your loved one is gone, get over it, let's adjust to life without them. But you mentioned Forever Family Foundation. I work with an organization called Helping Parents Heal, and
That's another, yeah.
and more now, and even in grief therapy now they're saying, well, maybe we should look at continuing bonds. Let's really look at the fact that person is still here, that we can still have a relationship with them. Let's understand who we are as human beings, that we're not just these biological accidental robots, that we, as you said, we come from some place and we have some place to go back to. And that seems to be a lot more healing for people than this idea of just get over it, move on.
Yeah. I think AA was very groundbreaking in bringing spiritual psychotherapy, into the game, just in terms of, the steps and serenity prayer. And so that kind of infiltrated itself into psychotherapy, and then, mindfulness came in, CBD came in. And so I think, in a way, holistic spiritual psychotherapy is now, seen as a lot more interdisciplinarian. And so, and when I work in private practice, I work for, let's say, a clinic, we don't just see a client, we work on the medical, we work, with recovery oriented coaches. We work, and I facilitate around, 3 mindfulness groups per week. So I think the more resources that we're able to give people and checking our egos out at the door, I think we're able to understand the person as a holistic being, as, much more than just one dimensional, not the multidimensional, and being able to not limit them with resources, at hand. I think that's
Yeah.
the place to go from.
So you work as you're a certified hypnotherapist, you're a certified Reiki Master, you're a clinical social worker, and you specialize in past life regression. So how do you integrate this into your practice when you're seeing clients?
A key tenet within psychotherapy and social work 101 is learning how to meet the client where their feet are at and
Hmm.
entering their world. And for a lot of people, that's a very, very vulnerable position, to take yourself out of the equation and to enter someone's world. But in the way, that's how people are very much helped, because they're feeling very alone. And so,
Hmm.
in the way, it's a lot of bit about it is understanding. And so the person's here and you're looking up at them, not always down on them, or just kind of seeing them as a pathologized diagnosis and stuff like that, but rather as a
Hmm.
comprehensive, resilient, strong person that you're trying to develop self-efficacy and enhance superpowers of resilience in the face of adversity and learning ways to integrate them. And so through private practice, there's assessment phases that I'll do where I don't accept every client. Not every client is appropriate. For services, some would be better suited with other clinicians or other modalities of treatment. But at least within private practice, there's a lot more autonomy that I have where someone comes into me, collaboratively, we kind of discuss, okay, maybe starting with, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, or dialectical behavioral therapy, or some of my other services, mindfulness, based services, or consciousness consulting. And if for other people, they've tried all those modalities and they're just hitting the wall, that's when maybe working with subconscious mind might be helpful with hypnosis, or, something that I do within groups and individuals as past life regression therapy is quite resourceful, in a sense that I ultimately think that we're here to evolve, our souls, as Darwin talked about evolution of the body. I think it's no different within the souls. And so it's very hard for people because the number one question that people has is, why am I here? What's my purpose? So much of who we are is based on kind of the clouded layers of built up perception that other people have put on us, which has looked at us as a blank slate. And so we've internalized that viewpoint, in our perception, how we see ourselves. And ultimately, I think we act on based on how we're informed of the world. How we are informed of God will impact how we handle this lifetime. And it's a mirror reciprocal dynamic. And as we expand that viewpoint, so too our life's purpose expands. And I view past life regression as a great way to really expand consciousness, to expand awareness, to be able to understand a lot more of not what we are, but who we truly are, so that we're
Yeah.
able to go through life with more grace and ease and guidance within our lives.
This may not be a fair question, but people.
Bring it on.
I've heard people ask. Well, I sometimes we ask people that have an experience like they know everything, but I'm going to ask you anyway. So, we obviously you believe in reincarnation. You believe that we come here more than once. So why don't we remember our past lives? I mean, you talk about past life regression, and I know people that do it. I know people that have done it, and they say it's extremely helpful. So what's the deal with the forgetfulness?
I think there's great beauty in the journey. The journey is never ending. Sometimes within the journey, we have a knowing that comes to us directly, and sometimes we just have to trudge along with faith, and trust in it. Ultimately, if everything was so clear, then why would we be here on Earth? I think we come here, and in many ways, it's polarity to just the clear knowing, in a sense that this Earth is, there's darkness. There's a lot of times where we don't have all those higher sensory awakenings of awareness, full force. And I think so much of that is, well, how could we possibly evolve without challenges presented our way? It's very hard for us to have a bicep curl and not feel that bit of pain or that hurt. But at the end of the day, that is a direct correlationship. And I view pain and gain as a great and late Betty Wright would say, right? No pain, no gain.
Mm-hmm.
It's very much correlated, and I don't view that as a punishment or a prison sentence. So I don't necessarily think we're here to acquire, but rather to remember or reintegrate what's truly inside of ourselves. And I think ultimately that's a lot of the soul's purpose, isn't in becoming something or someone else that we're not, but learning ways to remember that and re-experience that and reintegrate that. And so that's a very versatile concept. And so in the face of my experience, let's just say, when you have finite challenges such as suffocation presented your way, when you have nothing to hold on to, when you looked at darkness, when you lose a loved one, and everything tells you that this is the end. And for people, we understand the correlation with that degree of suffering and that degree of change and evolution. It's very hard to meet someone who hasn't gone through, transformation without, being that phoenix out of the ashes, so to speak. So I view that's very much something that no one's immune from, just in terms of the challenges. But I think if it was all clearly in front of us, then where would the free will come into play? When would the decision come into play? And when would this journey come into play that we're all here to continue to stay a part of? Which at times that journey is very clear, and other times we're like, what the hell is going on? But to continue to stay on course, is a part of our evolution, or part of our strength, and a part of this human experience. And there's no one who's got full clarity at all times. Sometimes, at times there's clouds, and sometimes we see the sun coming in through, but I think reminding ourselves the sun is always there. The truth is always there, despite some of those blockages where we might trust in that. So I think a lot of this is being able to entrust in faith, knowingness, and the higher forces of spiritual guidance over our own limited viewpoint.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's when we're able to be a lot more resilient and evolve quicker.
Yeah. Yeah, great answer. Very, very well said. I think it's the pain and the forgetfulness and all. It's all part of the thing we set up for ourselves. And as you said earlier, I use the gym analogy. I use the obstacle course analogy. I'm like, this our life is kind of like an obstacle course, which wouldn't be much of an obstacle course if there were no obstacles.
Right.
If you just ran from point A to point B and there was nothing in between, that would kind of suck as an obstacle course. So right. I think we set these challenges out for ourselves.
Right. And ultimately, I think a lot of things are charted for us because, when we cross over, part of it is each lifetime, I think, is more of an opportunity to be able to integrate that inner part of ourselves within each lifetime.
Hmm.
And so I think from losing ourselves, we're able to refine ourselves. And from loss, from pain, we lose that part of ourselves, but we regain a different part of ourselves. And so I think in the way there's always lessons that are there for each and every one of us. And it's ultimately lessons are no longer needed to be repeated from those greater messages being embraced. And I think once those messages are being embraced and heard, we're able to really ascend, travel into upper stratospheres of evolutions of our soul's growth within each and every lifetime. But again, perception is reality. We could see this as, you know, a victimization. We could see this as, a punishment or purgatory, this earth plane, or it's very easy to see that. Or, I try to take the high road on a personal, professional basis where I see this as, an opportunity of finite challenges with infinite consequences and measures.
Wow, beautiful.
So I
Wow.
think all these things are the power that we give themselves power to, but if this body, this lifetime is all impermanent. Now what we take from that, what we extract to that has infinite potentiality. And so I think when we give more power to the infinite versus more power to the finite, we're starting to get on track towards, really kind of evolving within our lifetimes. And I know that happened to myself and other near-death experiencers
Hmm.
and other people who with intense loss and intense transformation. Ultimately, we don't really go through those moments without understanding where we give our energy to. And I think it's ultimately giving our energy to resilient and infinite over the finite challenges presented in ourselves, in our front of ourselves.
Yeah. Another concept I want to ask you about is that concept of karma, because that comes up a lot as we talk about these, experiences. And so when I hear about your past life where you were a teacher, and you're a teacher now, and you felt like you let your students down, I believe, and that caused you some trauma in this life. So do you think karma plays into that? And what's your view of karma?
Yeah, I don't think it's a punishment. I think in a way it's an opportunity. I think in a way from completion we begin. We enter different bodies with different structures, but those similar moves on the chessboard are kind of similar.
Hmm.
And the more skillful we get, right, within each lifetime, the better their chess moves will make, much like that movie, The Queen's Gambit. And I don't, you can see it's many ways, but I kind of view this as the more skillful we get, the better moves we'll make, and the more, we'll be able to really ascend, the board. Um, I kind of see, at least from my lifetime, I look at the near-death experience and that the past life recollection as all kind of intertwined in one, in a sense that ultimately we're here to trust what's inside of us a lot more than the challenge in front of us. And when I certainly committed suicide, and others who have had suicidal ideations or attempts, and those who committed suicide, from my understanding, is we're not condemned, we're not judged. It's we go to the other side. It's totally diametrically opposite than love as we know it, or as the treatment that we get here. It's
Mhm.
in the spirit of St. Valentine's Day a day ago, it's an ever-ending love. It's a love that has no limits or bounds. And it's a love that doesn't love you from what you do, but who you truly are. Because to not love yourself, if we are indeed a part of God, would be to condemn or not love the source from which it came from.
Right.
How was that possible?
Right.
So I think, at our core, we're here to remember that part of ourselves. But I think the suicide, in a sense, that I was able to remind myself from was just that allegorical reference of the light at the end of the tunnel, where no matter what we're going through, we have to be privy to and careful with where we give our power to. When we give our power to our own limited perception of reality, our own anxieties, our own fears that feel very much real, that could take us on a wild course of its own. Versus the clear understanding that we can never be hurt nor damaged by almost anything, even if it seems that way, that there's an eternal vessel within ourselves. And if we're
Hmm.
able to have that as a hallmark part of our true foundation, then truly we're able to have a lot more resilience in the face of challenges through grace and ease, through that understanding. And I think ultimately it's once people see themselves as more than their emotions, more than their body, but as an infinite soul, that's when they're a lot more capable of handling challenges. It doesn't mean that we're not uh, challenged. It doesn't mean that we're not off kiltered. No one's immune from that, but it means that we're able to pivot a little bit easier. And I think that's when, mindfulness comes into play. Not so much, in judging ourselves, we're not perfect, but when we observe ourselves getting off base and be able to recenter, and just reset, a little bit more within our
Mhm.
lifetimes.
Yeah, I think there's, and I've talked to people who have, practiced Eastern religions. I think there's a big misunderstanding about karma that we need to reframe. And what I heard you saying is kind of like, it's almost like a chance to do it again. It's like, it's not a punishment. It's like, yeah, go back and you have to do this again. It's more like, oh, okay, I think maybe I could do this a little bit better. So I'll do similar circumstances and hopefully do better. And so it's interesting that you were a teacher in this most recent life, and then this is what you're doing now from, it seems like to me, a more skillful position.
I try, and I
Yeah.
talk about very vulnerable, and a lot of near-death experiences go through this. It's in the book. I had some degrees of suicidal ideations and
Hmm.
stuff like that. And thankfully, my father's a therapist, was able to help me. So again, still some of that came to the forefront.
Hmm.
And still working with clients, who were clients who came from the hospitals with suicidal ideations and suicide attempts. So from personal and professional, that's just something that, I agreed to contract with. And,
Yeah.
I think ultimately, I think it's getting people a little bit more tools and a little bit more resilience and a little bit more support, around them. But I think I look at, spirituality is a great superpower in the face of challenges, in a sense that you're able to feel sense and know a lot more around you, than you might be limited within your own emotional mind or your own, analytical mind that might drive you down a deep hole. And so I think you're able to surrender yourself to a lot more of a greater belief system and energy, even if it feels like it's fantasy, it does help you out. Um,
Yeah.
so
Yeah. Well, we're recording this on February 15th, 2021. We are hopefully coming to the end of the coronavirus pandemic. But people around the world, we're in all kinds of fear. We're in grief. What are some lessons that people can take from your experience that we can apply to what we're going through right now?
absolutely. Once we think it's the end, it's not. The end is the greatest illusion, and that is produced by the linear mind, which is
Hmm.
function from beginning to end. That's how it works. That's how it operates. It's linear. There's a start, there's an ending. And that's true of this body. That's true of this lifetime. There's an impermanence. But I think what people have to bear in mind is how illusionary that is, and how at our true nature, past the mind is an eternal soul that can never be truly hurt nor damaged. And I think truly, ultimately, everyone who's here alive obviously deserves a medal in a way from still being here, because these are very challenging times. Ultimately, these are not the most challenging times we've ever had, but I think for most of us within this lifetime, this has been. But I think perception is a great reality, and seeing
Hmm.
this as a reminder of how strong we truly are. Otherwise, we truly wouldn't be here. There's nothing that we would be provided to that we couldn't truly handle. And knowing that in this age, we don't have to do it all alone. I think within many cultures, the Mr. Mrs. Atlas is very much highlighted. But I think that's very illusionary for who and what we truly are, in a sense that we have support systems on this earth planes and those in the satellites in the heavens. And I think it's being able to, at times, when we're feeling that we can't do it, to be able to surrender ourselves, to carry ourselves, to propel ourselves through these times. I think ultimately there's great growth in that, because once we think we could do it all, there's no need for change or transformation. And so we could get a little bit stagnant with that, Mr. Atlas kind of identity.
Hmm.
I think the second part is the ability to, like we said before, to understand the griefs, the hallmarks of challenges in its relationship with evolution. It's very hard to see someone who's that strong person that we see on the surface who hasn't gone through a lot of what.
Hmm.
Um, and so that doesn't come without cause. Everything, there's a ripple effect with everything that we see. There's so much more than the surface. And I think ultimately, the more objective that we're able to see ourselves past this moment, and the more understanding that we are able to understand from these particular moments that led to, from infinite struggle led to finite gains and measures, I think is important too. Um, and I think also it's important to understand the value of it's okay to not be okay. There's plenty of resources out there. There's plenty of people who join you in that sentiment. And I think ultimately, from an individual to collective, I think once people are able to join each other in the common ground of struggle, I think we're able to be a lot more unified. I think,
Mm.
once people see themselves as, if this doesn't directly affect me, no longer affects me, that no longer really is applied, because I think everyone is in a similar storm and everyone's got their own set of circumstances. But the more we're able to see outside of ourselves, the more that we're able to clearly see inside of ourselves. We are infinitely connected. We're not isolated agents, just here to pay the bills and pay our mortgages and retire at a certain age, but rather, much like my experience in the playground, we are our brothers and children's gatekeepers here playing in this playground of God, and we're
Mm.
here to look after one another. And through different steps of the ladder, through different challenges, we're able to see the light a little bit clearer with different rungs and different lifetimes of our life ladders,
Wow.
travels.
Wow. Wow. I think that's a great way to wrap up the interview, Jacob. I got to tell you, it's been an honor having you here. It's obvious that you've lived more than one life. You could not have gathered this much wisdom in 30 years. So I really appreciate you sharing this with us. The book is excellent. It's called Life After Breath. How can people reach you if they want to know more about you?
Yes, so you could go on my website at www.jacobelcooper.com. And there you could find, let's just say, if you want to email me, there's an email icon, or there's a Facebook icon for my professional page, and there also Instagram too. So my whole goal is to give back what I was given in moments of deprivation of oxygen, which was inspiration in eternity in the face of facing finite head on. I was able to see the illusion of finite the most I can. And so my job is to give back what I was given. And that's my goal. And I think if that inspires you, my hope is that you could do the same and you could give your hand to help someone stand. And I think we're all here to help out each other. And we're here very much here in this Earth School to be our brothers and sisters, gatekeepers and guides. Because that's ultimately, what we're a part of here in this divine, unique symphony that we're all a part of. And the more our sound is in higher harmony with the higher octaves of the other side, the better it's going to sound and the more harmonized our collective symphony will be, so that heaven doesn't have to be something that we wait for, hold our breath to. Rather, it's something that it's right here that we could exhalate to. And so my website, you could look at my book, resources. If you're interested in individual services or any other questions, it's always a pleasure to hear and to create community and to take away the illusion of isolation.
Awesome. Thanks, Jacob. You have a great rest of your day.
Brian, thank you so much for having me on your wonderful program. Keep up the excellent work. And thank you, viewers, for listening. I hope that you were able to take something with you, that you'd be able to integrate spiritual measures to practical measures in your everyday lives.
That's it for another episode of Grief to Growth. I sure hope you got something out of it. Please stay in contact with me by reaching out at www.grieftogrowth.com. That's grief, the number 2, growth.com. Or you can text the word growth to 31996. That's simply text growth, GROWTH, to 31996. Since you're watching this on YouTube, please make sure you're subscribed. So hit the subscribe button and then hit the little bell here, and it'll notify you when I have new content. Always, please share the information if you enjoy it. That helps me to get more views and to get the message out to more people. Thanks a lot and have a wonderful day.